can. Thank you, Holly.
Thank you, Holly. Yeah, in the modern tradition. Next slide, please, Holly. Okay, right. Our overall, this is our background, our vision. We are on the island a conservative administration, and there is our vision to be an inspiring place in which to grow up, work, live and visit. The work part of that is quite important. Currently, we're rolling out broadband extensively to get better connected, because if we're better connected, we can get more employment. And people will stay on the island rather than get educated and leave to have to go somewhere else. So that's quite an important factor for us. And of course that leads on to think about, you know, where we're going forwards in climate change and infrastructure. We're quite a rural area, as you can imagine. So some of the challenges are different to in a city, it has to be said. I'm sure Cornwall will probably have similar issues. Our corporate strategy, as you can see, environment, unique island characteristics, and that's part of our challenge as well. Outstanding transport connectivity, well, that's a challenge as well as an island. You know, you can imagine we're very reliant on ferries and the workings of ferries, etc. Isle of Wight is a leading UK visitor destination, and probably this coming year will be more so than ever, I should imagine, because we're going to have a lot more staycations going forward. Next slide, please, Holly. So that leads us to where we were in July 2019, when I was approached by one of our opposition members, who is an independent now, was Green Party at the time. I do like to work collaboratively across party, across our council. I think it's quite important. So I was approached to support the motion that he was going to bring to the council for full council. And I thought, yeah, I can work with that. But when he sent a copy over to me, which basically was a copy and paste of Portsmouth City Council's declaration they'd just passed, I think the previous week, that's where it became a little bit more tricky from my perspective, because being a conservative administration, and some of our members in my group would readily admit they are climate skeptics. So my first battle was to work with the wording, and the wording that we had initially was quite extensive. It was a bit too rambling, and the first half of it talked about Manchester. And of course, one or two of my group were saying, well, what's it got to do with Manchester? So that became instantly a bit of a challenge of how do I redo this and reword it. So I rewrote it, sent it back over to him. He came back, and we backwards and forwards collaboratively till we got the wording right, which is what we have here. So we're looking to declare a climate emergency, develop an action plan, and that's very important as well. I'm becoming quite known in our council, I think, for whenever we have a strategy come forward, it has to have an action plan, because a strategy without an action plan is a piece of paper. So that was very important that we, you know, can't just do it, you've got to have a plan of where you're going with it. And you see our aim is to be carbon neutral by 2030. And as it says there at the bottom there, assess the science. That's very important, because you know, you can't just wish for something and hope you can do it. You've got to know what's behind it and how you're going to achieve it. So next slide, please, Holly. Oh yes, and rapidly on the heels of our declaration of climate emergency, we also had a motion on our biosphere. We are a UNESCO biosphere now. We have that status, which is fantastic. And again, that's brilliant for tourism, because you know, somebody could be sat the other side of the world looking on the UNESCO website and see where, you know, who has biosphere status, and the little old Isle of Wight has it. So part of their visitation is going to be to us, which is fantastic. And we're just really trying to achieve, we have AONB a great chunk of our island, and we're trying to get dark skies designation as well. So if we can put all that together, it'd be fabulous. And then, so from my perspective, that's the lead in, how we got there. I mean, there's how do you declare a climate emergency? You have to declare it via a motion. So we got that together, and why? Well, the reason why was really to give political direction to the council to install right through the council a climate change thinking into the DNA of the council. So everything that we do and everything, whatever areas from procurement through to everything that we do is now got climate change in there. Right, so from here, I'm going to pass over to Holly Jones now to run through the next slides.
Hi there, everyone. So I've come into the council a few months ago to work on the climate strategy and action plan. So starting with baseline. So other than the baseline carbon footprint, which we'll actually come back to later, Isle of Wight Council has got various baselines to work from when we've produced the action plan. These are spread across various areas that feed into the action plan. So some of the ones that we're currently working with are that 36% of homes on the island are currently well insulated. So we've been able to set a target around this to improve energy efficiency. Because the Isle of Wight is a very rural area, well, a lot of rural areas across the island, most people do still drive to travel around the island. We're working towards improving active and sustainable travel across the island, but there are some fairly large challenges around this, particularly in those rural areas. The island currently has around 90 megawatts of renewable energy generation locally. This is, again, something that we're aiming to increase, but there are some infrastructure challenges locally that we do need to address before we can start, creating more renewable generation locally. Currently, 13% of the island is covered by trees. So this is higher than the average for England, but it doesn't really compare to other similar areas, for example, across Europe. And the Isle of Wight has already improved its recycling rate to 56%, but it is aiming for higher over the next 5 to 10 years. So this slide outlines how the council works locally. There are only quite limited actions that are directly within the council's control, and we have spent some time already communicating this and how it relates to climate action and what we can do. But there does still seem to be some question marks locally around how the council works and what exactly it can and can't do. So I'm sure a lot of people on the call are already familiar with this, but anything within council operations is relatively straightforward in terms of climate action. Not to say that it's easy, but the council just has more control to act. Anything that doesn't fall directly within council operations may end up being a lot more complex to work on. So the council has committed to supporting and influencing any stated outcomes where it can, but many of these will need to arise because of behavioural change or will need to be community-led. So this slide goes into a little bit more depth about what the council can and can't do. So again, within the council's own operations, we can make those changes relatively easily. And we expect to spend a good amount of the time over the first year or two of the strategy and action plan, embedding sustainability at the heart of the council's internal actions, like Steve had mentioned a minute ago. So there are various plans that will feed into the climate and environment strategy, and the climate and environment strategy will likewise feed into different council strategies and plans over time. And again, the wider island, so what exactly can the Isle of Wight Council facilitate and influence, and that we recognise that there are some things that will just be beyond the council's reach. So Tash, over to you for this slide.
Thank you. Hi. So the Isle of Wight, unlike some of the presentations you've seen already, are still very much in the planning and policy development phases. We have been working for a long time as a council dealing with climate change across many different of our departments, but not under an integrated climate change policy. We have over the last 10 years worked very hard to operate. We've had national conferences on climate change and landslides. We have one of the largest landslide complexes in northwestern Europe that is populated, that is suffered a lot over the years from the effects of sea level rise and subaerial erosion and collapses. So we've been dealing with climate change through our shoreline management plans and our fluvial coastal strategies, our flooding strategies historically. And now we're moving to a point where we want to draw together the sort of 20 or 30 different policies that we have into a single climate and environment strategy. But we're very much also looking at the same time as shifting from a council that looks on short-term actions to a council that looks at long-term outcomes. And we've seen this as a very opportune moment to look at that 2030, 2040 line, and where in that the science places the council estate versus the rest of the island as a whole population and environmental area in terms of reaching net carbon, or ideally carbon zero, by 2030. In terms of our own estate, we're looking very much to develop, as we said, the strategy for monitoring carbon footprint, including, as we've discovered over the last 12 months, a huge shift in the way that we work means that now 95% of our workforce are working from home. Many of them intend to continue doing so. So one of the key things we want to do right now is develop a strategy to look at how we're going to measure our carbon footprint when our workforce is no longer in many of our buildings, but are working from home, and how we include that back into our carbon modelling. We have a carbon management strategy. We've made huge successes over the last 10 years in reducing our buildings' carbon through reducing buildings, through changing our ICT, through behaviour change activities, and we're going to continue looking at that to reach that net carbon zero by 2030. In terms of implementation, we have been quite successful recently in getting the Salix low carbon heating system project funding for 10 of the buildings that we have, where we will be changing our heating systems to air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps for 10 of our larger buildings and leisure centres. We'll be seeking further carbon initiatives in our building stock over the coming years and looking at options for cladding. We have a very, very old stock of buildings within our authority that are mostly single-skinned aluminium frame windowed, very municipal 1970s buildings that are not at all geared towards any kind of energy efficiency. So we have a lot of challenges to deal with, as well as having a server bank of our own ICT servers on the island rather than a cloud server system. So we've got a lot of small challenges to deal with. And then we want to look at embedding climate change adaptation and low carbon behaviours across our corporate DNA. One of the ways we've started doing this is through having directorate-wide officer groups, where we talk about training the entire management level to then train their own staff beneath them on carbon literacy and how to look at adaptation and resilience to climate change as part of their day-to-day living. For example, historically, we worked very in a siloed way. We would have our low carbon projects teams would promote free insulation through Facebook and the internet and the usual ways that you advertise things. And we've taken the shift on that and said, hang on a minute, we have social care teams who go into all homes across the island and are aware where there's fuel poverty issues, are aware where there's cold homes. So we've started, rather than externally advertising things in a siloed way, to getting all of our teams and all of the different areas to look at how they can build adaptation to climate change within the way that they deliver their services across social services and across learning and development and planning, and really integrate that as a core decision making, a core part of thinking as part of the greater population well-being piece, because the population needs to adapt to the changing climate, adapt to the hotter summers and the colder winters. And that's not only for climate change and carbon purposes, it's also for their well-being, and influencing the well-being of the population is one of the core purposes of a local authority. That's really how we've enabled a lot of our staff to see climate change as more than just an issue for the lefties and the muesli eaters and the sandal wearers, and something that actually is relative to all of us and the way that we operate in all of our different levels of local authority service delivery. Ollie, can I next slide? Okay, so outside of the authority's control, we have the things, as Holly said, are the outcomes that we want to achieve across our population going forward. So we want our islands community to be enabled to achieve net carbon zero themselves. One of the key ways that we've developed working with our community is the development of what we call the Environment and Sustainability Forum, which is an open forum that meets monthly. It is open to all members of the public, all active groups. I know that there's nothing wrong with the muesli, sandals and barefoot folk. I'm one of them. Just notice the comment on the side there. But we do want to enable our community to be able to achieve that. So we've started this forum where we have people from all political groups, all active groups, and all levels of community can join without any restriction on a monthly basis to come and discuss the issues at hand. We have an annual agenda for different subjects that we discuss each month, with presentations from other local authorities and universities to bring the science and bring the social surfaces and bring the different delivery models of how people deal with sustainable transport, through to electric vehicles, through to rewilding our verges, into that community aspect, and then push it back out again to let our town parish councils know where they can find the funding, to know where our active groups can find funding, and to really lead and promote that engagement in those opportunities for residents to find grants and for businesses to get engaged in the programme. We call it the Environment and Sustainability Forum, and when we want to provide and enable learning opportunities to enable landowners, as you know, we are a very rural community. Much of the island is farmland, and we really want to start looking at landowners and engaging with biodiversity next gain. The Hampshire and Wight Wildlife Trust are currently working with a lot of adaptive farming techniques in a few areas on the island, and we're looking at training sessions, and we're talking about doing some education sessions to talk about how hedgerows are an important part of our biodiversity net gain, as well as the woodland, seagrass and kelp bed opportunities looking forward. And we want to make sure that we are providing learning opportunities to bring together the different parts of our community to look at how we can adapt our land use going forward. Next slide, please, Holly. Okay, the other big issue for us as an island, we have a severance factor. We are clearly separated from the mainland. We have a huge issue with electricity in that our grid capacity is at its maximum, and we cannot actually add any further alternative energy sources to the grid at this point in time without a new interchanger being installed under the channel, which is several £1 million cost to SSE, and they're not willing to do that without having sufficient potential sites available to buy into that to cover the cost of developing a fourth interchanger. So we've started looking at making sure that we can build some resilience in terms of what we have on the island. We're just finishing an energy from waste plant, for example, at the moment, which we're going to look at have parasitic load of electricity on a private wire network to run the nearby recycling facilities, and then also look at heat networks coming off of there to run civic buildings such as the local hospitals and prisons, which the bays have been quite positive and supportive with and looking forward to funding. So again, with energy and water resilience, we need to find ways to develop sustainable private wire networks here to step outside of the current grids. Can we look at the next one, please? The Isle of Wight Council are also, and the community are resilient to a changing climate. This is a key bit of social work side of what we want to try and change on the island, and that's to enable and support the residents of the island to ensure their homes are well insulated. We have a really high fuel poverty rate, which we want to reduce. We also have a very high retirement population, with 35% of our population in the retirement bracket. We need to make sure that as our population ages, that we have care homes and sheltered homes and adaptive homes that are able to cope with colder winters and hot summers. Again, we're talking about agriculture and how we're adapting what we do in our field systems. And then the strategic infrastructure, we're clearly obviously looking at transport networks, sustainable transport and increasing funds. Holly, you can change the slides. I've just seen my 1 to 2 minute call there, so I'm going to talk faster. We also mentioned that we do have a biosphere here, and that biosphere is really, really key to us to ensuring that we can promote using the biosphere to help our local agricultural growing businesses see that as a benefit, and see that benefit as something that we can then help them work with their carbon footprint, but also then promote things such as their products that they grow on the island as biosphere products as a part of their unique selling point. So to embrace the net biodiversity gain within the biosphere, but also then adapt the businesses and how they grow to ensure that we're lowering the carbon footprint of some of the huge greenhouse complexes that we have here. Equally, we'd like everywhere else need to look at our littering and fly tipping. I think everyone's seen that across the country has been awful this year. Holly, do you want to move on to the next one? We're short on time.
Yeah, sure. So just coming back to the carbon footprint baselines very briefly. So the Isle of Wight Council's baseline footprint is just over 4,000 tonnes, whereas the island's footprint is almost 507,000 tonnes. So coming back to that point about, you know, what the council controls versus what's outside of our control, really only about not even 1% of emissions on the Isle of Wight is directly controlled by the council. So we've set a target of net zero with a 15% offset over the next 10 years. So just wanted to outline the island's carbon footprint as well, and the different sectors that are contributing to that. I think it's mostly fairly in line with the UK's national footprint, other than potentially domestic heating is a bit higher for the Isle of Wight, because a lot of the island is currently not on the gas network. So we have a lot of older housing stock that's still heated by oil boilers. and I think we're burning stoves a lot of the time as well. And just to wrap up, we just wanted to highlight some of the progress to date. So our climate and environment strategy is fairly new, but work has been going on in the background for quite some time now on the Isle of Wight. So I'll just whiz through these quite quickly. So the council carbon footprint has actually decreased by about 65% already since 2009. And we've received funding for works under the Salix Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme, which will be completed later on this year. I've mentioned a key aspect over the first couple of years of the plan will be around engagement. So in terms of that, we've already started the monthly forums. We're updating the council's climate change section of the website, and we're developing some work around social media and a couple of other areas as well. Active travel, the council was actually granted funding in 2019 from the Access Fund, and currently there are 19 projects underway or completed. So these have already reduced carbon from travel by just under 4,500 tonnes. In terms of waste and recycling, I've mentioned that the council has already improved its recycling rate to 56%, and it's now rated 36th in the country. There's also the new energy from waste plant in progress that Tash had mentioned. And lastly,
we have actually hit, sorry, I'm just going to jump in with a bit of practical here. Sorry, we have just recently got to a point now where for the last quarter we've been at 99% diversion from landfill of all waste on the island, which is something we're very proud of in terms of reducing our carbon footprint. Sorry, carry on.
Thanks. Yeah, so last point was really just around planning. So the draft island planning strategy was published, I think, early 2020, and it already contains a wide range of measures that are, aimed to lower the carbon footprint of the island and protect the island's wider environment. So this includes keeping development away from the most sensitive areas, ensuring that ecological and environment mitigation or compensation are required, along with biodiversity net gain, and it also increases support for renewable energy projects, although again we have that sort of ongoing issue with the infrastructure locally. So I think that brings us to the end.
Thank you.